All right, I think we can go ahead and get started. Hello, and thank you everyone so much for joining us tonight for Resilience, the Secret Life of Trees. We have just under, I think we're gonna hit around 200 people by the end of my introduction, and we have 350 people registered for this program tonight, so that is very exciting. My name is Kayla Del Biondo, and I'm coordinator of adult programming and outreach at New Canaan Library. In October 2020, the library was awarded the American Library Association's Resilient Communities Grant. The basic premise of this grant is to screen films and host public programs that encourage community conversations around climate change. One parameter of the grant required us to partner with a local organization, and when I approached Aaron Lefland, Executive Director of New Canaan Land Trust, he enthusiastically agreed to collaborate. Along the way, we've received support from Planet New Canaan, the New Canaan Conservation Commission, and other partners in New Canaan's pollinator pathway, which we're extremely grateful for. Tonight's program is the kickoff for a 4-part monthly resilience series, where we will screen a 40-minute documentary, Treeline, and then enjoy a panel discussion with foresters, ecologists, and land managers working in Connecticut's forests, led by Aaron. The other programs will take place on March 10th, where we'll have a discussion around the film Fire and Flood, Queer Resilience in an Era of Climate Change. April 24th, we'll host a community conference around the film Decoding the Weather Machine. And finally, May 12th, where we will welcome Dr. Andrew Rainman, and he'll give a lecture on champion trees, and we'll invite the community to take part in a citizen science initiative here in New Canaan. If you've yet to register for the remainder of this 4-part series, I encourage you to do so at newcanaanlibrary.org/calendar. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Aaron, who will give a brief introduction about our panelists and call your attention to certain features of Zoom we'll be using tonight. So prior to joining the Land Trust in 2017, Aaron received a Master of Forest Science from the Yale School of the Environment, where he studied the sustainable management of New England's forests and published peer-reviewed journal articles about community forestry and the demographics of important timber species. His previous experience includes running a low-impact forest management operation and conducting ecological research related to long-term changes in forest composition. So take it away, Aaron.
Thanks, Kayla, and thank you all for joining us. Thank you to the library for allowing us to co-host this along with Planet New Canaan and the town of New Canaan. We're absolutely thrilled by the huge registration numbers that we've seen for this event, and I think we've got a really great series of events coming up over the next 4 months. I think this topic is just so relevant to the work of our partners and especially to the work of the Land Trust, whose mission is to conserve land, steward it for the benefit of our community and for the environment. We have nearly 400 acres protected. About half of that is open to the public with trails, and we actively manage it for habitat, for recreation, and for other purposes. So everything here is sort of right in the wheelhouse of the Land Trust, and we're thrilled to be able to bring this to our community. Our panelists tonight, I'm going to be joined by Matt Vines, who works for the Urban Resource Initiative in New Haven, Connor Hogan, who is the director of the McLean Wildlife Refuge in Simsbury, Connecticut, and Laura Green, who is an adjunct lecturer at Southern Connecticut State University. We'll get into more intros and bios for them a little bit later after the film screening. But before we get started, I do just want to go over a few housekeeping things, as Kayla mentioned. The first is to use the Q&A feature during the film and the panel discussion. We're not going to be checking the chat window as much just because things kind of get lost in there. So if you do have a question that you want us to discuss during the panel, go ahead and type that into the Q&A feature on the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get to as many of those questions as possible. It's also worth noting that we're using Zoom's closed captioning feature, and you can toggle that on and off. That's also on the bottom of your screen, and that'll be providing live closed captions. So if you're hearing impaired or otherwise just want those closed captions available, you should have that option sort of in the bottom right of your screen and can toggle that on or off. Lastly, I'll just mention that if for any reason the video isn't cooperating, specifically the film that we're going to be watching, Treeline, it is available on YouTube, and we're going to post a link to it in the chat window. So feel free to hop out, watch it on YouTube. That might just work better with your system, and then rejoin the Zoom webinar for the panel discussion afterwards. So with that, sit back, relax, and enjoy. And join me while I introduce them. Our first panelist is Laura Green. Laura is an adjunct lecturer in the biology department at Southern Connecticut State University, where she teaches about botany, and she's also a consulting forester and naturalist. Her previous experience includes managing the research and naturalist programs at the Yale Forests and researching understory plant communities in southern New England. She holds a Master of Forestry from the Yale School of the Environment and a Bachelor's of Arts in Geography from Vassar College, and is a Connecticut licensed forester. Our second panelist is Connor Hogan, who is the director of the McLean Game Refuge. That's a 4,400-acre wildlife sanctuary in northern Connecticut. In this role, he designs and implements all of the research, conservation, management, education, and recreation activities at the refuge. He frequently works with and serves as a resource for land trusts and other conservation organizations in the region. He holds a Master of Forestry from the Yale School of the Environment and a Bachelor of Arts from Bates College, and is a Connecticut licensed forester. Last but certainly not least, we have Matt Vines. He is the Green Skills Program Manager at the Urban Resources Initiative in New Haven, which is an urban forestry nonprofit that fosters community-based land stewardship programs. He's overseen a number of programs at URI, including street planting, green jobs training, and most recently, supervising the installation of 175 bioswales throughout the downtown New Haven area. Matt holds a Master's of Environmental Management from the Yale School of the Environment, a Bachelor's of Science in Environmental Science and Policy from the University of Maryland, and is an ISA certified arborist. So thank you guys for joining us. And to get the panel started, I thought one of the sort of overarching themes of the film was that of tree ring counting or dendrochronology. Folks who aren't familiar with tree ring research probably recognize the tree rings that were sort of being panned through in the video. And what's actually going on there is a scientist is using a sliding scale to move the tree rings across the microscope lens. And every time they do that, the distance that the tree ring is traveling across the scale is being measured so that they get a precise measurement in microns for the width of each tree ring. And so I'm hoping you guys can talk a little bit about the role that data plays in climate science and climate records. I think one of the first sort of featured scientists talked about it a little bit, but maybe we can give our audience a little bit more information about sort of how that works and what information we can get from trees.
I'm happy to kind of kick this off. Tree ring research is been a fabulous way to study past climatic activity by piecing together fragments of trees and wood across centuries. In fact, I believe the oldest continuous line of tree data is in the UK. I think it goes back some 13,000 years or so. And the way they do that is they have living oak trees in the UK that they can take samples from that are 800 to 1,000 years old. But they also have, in a lot of the bogs, they've recovered pieces of oak trunks that have been perfectly preserved in the peat that are a whole different range of ages and origins, but that date way back to the earliest human civilization following the retreat of the glaciers in Northern Europe. So it can tell us a lot about flooding, temperature changes, gas in the atmosphere.
And fire patterns as well. I believe you can see sort of fire scars in some of the tree rings and see sort of the frequency and also sometimes even the intensity of forest fires. Yeah, anything else, Matt or Laura, you guys want to add to that?
No, I think that's a great summary. And I appreciated the emphasis in the film about sort of the way that kind of research can connect us back to those really long time scales, which can feel, it's hard to conceptualize how long is 13,000 years, how long is 5,000 years. I think it's really powerful to sort of be reminded that there is this like living legacy of that's still present with us in the form of these trees.
Yeah, and one of the audience questions that came up is sort of where are examples of old growth forests in the area that we might be able to see. I think it's pretty interesting for folks to, when they first learn that most of the forests in Connecticut are relatively not old. Vast majority are 100 years or so, because most of our forests were blown down in a hurricane in the 1930s. I believe we do have some examples of old growth forest in the northern sort of hills of Connecticut. There's a place called Cathedral Pines. I want to say it's not Simsbury.
Litchfield.
Litchfield, right? Okay.
Or excuse me, Cornwall.
Cornwall, yeah, that's right, Cornwall. So that's sort of one example of old growth. But beyond that, there's a couple remnant patches of it. I know on sort of mountain hilltops where settlers and agricultural sort of expansion couldn't reach, or it was too rough. There's some old growth forests, but they don't look like much because they've been exposed to the wind and the elements and things like that. So not a lot in Connecticut, unfortunately. You do have to go sort of more north, and very frequently it is in that sort of rocky, not friendly terrain. So maybe moving on a little bit. Another theme in the film was about the interconnectedness of trees and forests. They talk about fungal networks and what we know as sort of mycorrhizal fungal networks. I was hoping some of our panelists could touch on this a bit more and maybe share stories about how they've seen this new research that's coming out about this interconnectedness being applied to forest management. And Matt, specifically, I'd be interested in knowing if you sort of working in a more urban environment have any information about how maybe that lack of a fungal network impacts some of those trees that you work with?
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. I was going to say there's really not much research on, or much research that has shown that these sorts of networks can or do exist in urban areas. Our urban soils are so disturbed. A lot of times they're actually characterized as a completely separate soil type than surrounding, intact native forest soils. So it's hard for those sort of fungal networks to develop. It's an interesting question. I don't know specifically how much the lack of a mycorrhizal network impacts tree health in urban areas, but we do know that by and large, trees that are in urban areas have somewhere around maybe a 30 to 50% shorter lifespan than do similar trees in native forests, and certainly that a number of things conspire against them in urban areas. And I would wager a guess that the lack of those sort of communication and nutrient networks is a big component of that.
And just to build off this question and bring in an audience question, someone said that knowing that trees sort of grown in these natural environments maybe have this mycorrhizal network, is it possible to mimic that, or sort of what's the time scale in restoring some of those networks when trees are cut for management or other reasons?
I'd like to I might chime in on that for a second. Fungal soil rejuvenation can happen relatively quickly depending on the scale you're talking about. There's a big movement. So please take what I say with a grain of salt. I'm not a farmer or a agro-scientist, but I know that no-till properties in soil help even a few years fallow. So soils can either be dominated by fungus or bacteria as communication networks through soil, transferring nutrients. And fungal networks are what exist when there's not disturbance, and they can reform relatively quickly in agricultural situations. I suspect it's relatively similar in forested situations. But if you're in a place that doesn't have that fungal network to begin with, that bringing it in requires a lot of work. And I know that in some places in the around Mount St. Helens after that blew in the 80s, that they actually, scientists dropped rotting logs from the surrounding forest that wasn't damaged onto the site to reintroduce some of the fungi that would occur there on the site to help kickstart that network. And that was way before Dr. Suzanne Simard was really pioneering a lot of the ideas that were presented in the movie.
Yeah, there is, it's called fungal inoculation. Essentially, it's artificial introduction of fungi that may not be in the soil. So a soil that's been impacted by a large-scale natural disaster like a volcanic eruption is a great example, but so are urban soils. The problem is it's so site and tree specific that it's hard to say whether and where exactly those sorts of techniques would be possible. I think it's a really interesting question, and in urban areas especially, but in forestry in general, this is really kind of on the cusp of what we're beginning to understand. So I think it's an exciting area for future research.
And just one more sort of follow-up question here from the audience is the concept of tree intelligence and communication based on scientific research? The answer to that is a resounding yes. what the film sort of glosses over is at one point we saw them put sort of a plastic bag over some pine needles and do a little bit of injecting or things like that. What the scientists and researchers are actually doing is putting a certain isotope into, allowing one tree to take up the isotope, and what they're able to do is measure that isotope in a different tree. And so they're able to essentially track nutrients and resources going from one tree to another because this isotope doesn't naturally occur. So it's certainly based in research. I do think the research is still sort of in its infancy, and we're going to learn a lot more in the coming years and decades. But it is a scientific concept. Mark that done. Oh, sorry, too many screens here. So sort of getting back to the core reason for this resilience series and sort of why we asked you guys to join us and talk about trees and climate change. You all have sort of different experiences working in forests or in urban forests or in forest understories, so you bring different perspectives to this. But I'm curious if you can each talk about a little bit about how trees can help in our efforts to mitigate the impacts of climate change. And this is a really broad topic, so I'm sure we'll have sort of some sub questions as we go along.
Who wants to start? Well, I can. Again, I'm coming at this from an urban forestry perspective, so that's what I'll share, and I'll let Laura and Connor expand on that. I mean, the impacts of trees are enormous. You know, they can help mitigate effects of climate change, and in urban areas, we're thinking about things like lessening the effect of urban heat islands. We know that on average, urban areas are hotter than surrounding urban areas, and that can come with really significant public health impacts. If you all are familiar with the Chicago heat wave in 1995, it led to the death of something like 750 Chicagoans. With climate change, we anticipate those sorts of extreme heat events will be more severe and more frequent. So simply, trees can help cool urban environments. And if they're helping cool urban environments, then they can help protect our vulnerable populations. Trees are also really good at intercepting and absorbing rainfall and runoff water, which can help. Again, another widely anticipated impact of climate change is more frequent and severe storm events. So if we can lessen the impacts of localized flooding, but also downstream flooding and pollution, that can have significant impacts, and trees really help with that as well. They're a big component of a lot of cities' green infrastructure programs for those reasons. I'll turn it over because I could talk on this for a really long time.
Yeah, I think that's one sort of side of the climate change conversation, is sort of how trees sort of provide services for us. We sort of call them ecosystem services or green infrastructure, things like that. So that's one side of the coin, and it's incredibly important for us to think about how trees provide these services to us essentially free of cost. And I know Laura and Connor are going to have some the other side of the coin thinking on this too. So let's hear from them.
Yeah, sure. I can sort of keep expanding on that. It's a little. I was initially like, I don't know where to start. There's so much. One of the things that's tricky about thinking about how we manage for climate change is just the incredible diversity in the ways that plays out across our landscape and across the world, depending on what has happened in a particular place in the past. What kinds of organisms are there now, the health of things like these fungal networks in the soil. For an example, there's evidence that having fungal networks in the soil help trees to take up water, and so there's some evidence that that can help sort of buffer against the stresses of drought, which is one of the outcomes of climate change that we see. And at the same time, that increased temperatures and that same drought can also change the composition of those sort of soil fungal communities. and perhaps negatively impact that beneficial, that sort of benefit of those fungal species and their associations with trees. And so all of this we're really kind of working fast and on the fly to figure out. And that's all very much sort of changing and growing, which is really exciting, but also makes it a little hard to sort of give really kind of big wholesale generalizations about what to do in any particular place. But there are some really wonderful resources from, there's an organization called the, so the abbreviation is NIACS, which I think is Northern Institute for Applied Climate Science, that has done a bunch of work in terms of putting together resources, sort of decision-making frameworks for people to think about, if I am thinking about my property or a place I love, what would it make sense to do here? There are some species of trees as well as animals and understory plants, smaller plants as well as trees that we think are not in a position to respond as well to the climate changes that we anticipate here in Connecticut. And there are other species on our landscape already that it seems like will likely do okay, just fine under the conditions we expect in the future. And so sort of figuring out, what is the balance that we have in a particular place now can help us think about, what could we do to help this place stay resilient, keep providing those services that we value, as well as kind of the aesthetic or spiritual value of having forests around into the future.
Yeah, so it sounds like the sort of this baseline information, sort of knowing, I mean, the forests are very dynamic systems and they're sort of always changing, but maybe knowing what they looked like before things really started changing in terms of anthropogenic climate change. And so I think you're touching on an important point as well, sort of where we take our forests from here, if we can facilitate a transition instead of letting them sort of suffer through this change that's happening. And I'll let Connor sort of give his thoughts on that. I think that's probably a good transition a little bit.
Yeah, I think one of the things, Laura's talking a bit about resiliency and how our forests going to be able to perform as we see climate changing. One of the things that's kind of unique about the forests of Connecticut is that they, oftentimes you think of climate as what defines a forest that exists in an area. Like when we saw those forests in British Columbia with Susan Simard, they are these forests that experience very little human impact over time. That doesn't mean that humans haven't been there and impacting the forest, but on the grand scale, it's relatively small. The fire return interval in those forests is 800 to 1200 years. So they live undisturbed for long periods. When you look at Connecticut, the history is really unique. We have this relatively cool climate, or historically we've had this relatively cool climate, yet we have a host of forests that are adapted to severe weather. We have oak and hickory dominated forests. We used to have oak and chestnut forests, but that's a tragedy for another conversation. But our forests here have been managed by humans for at least 1,000 years with confirmed data, but we suspect it's closer to 2,000 to 3,000 years. And across all of the mid-Atlantic and out into the central part of the United States for 10,000 or more years by Native Americans with periodic burns. And what that did is it created a forest that was resilient to heat and stress and drought, because oak trees and hickory trees have thick leaves that can withstand harsh temperatures. They have thick bark that can resist fire. They sprout quickly after fire burns them. And so in Connecticut, we're actually at this interesting cusp where after Euro-Americans cleared the forest, they sprouted back after that harsh treatment of clearing and burning and charcoaling with more oak forest. And for the first time in our forest history in New England, those oak and hickories are now growing dense and thick without any fire. And they're becoming maple and birch dominated forests. And I know that was a little bit long-winded, but what that means is as our oaks die from old age, over the next 100, 150 years, our forests will no longer be oaks and hickories. They'll be those kind of moisture-loving, shade-tolerant maples and birches. And they're not as tolerant to climate change. they're much more susceptible to drought, extreme weather conditions. And so, if we're looking at our forests over the long run, it's really important right now to take a hard look at how we are managing our forests across Connecticut. And are we preparing ourselves for climate change with species that have proven over the test of time that they can withstand harsh weather conditions?
And Connor, I think that's a really good segue into sort of thinking about, instead of maybe thinking about how trees can help mitigate sort of the traditional effects of climate change by like a lot of things we've discussed so far, how we can use them in a more active way to mitigate climate change. And one of the fascinating things that's been looked at a lot lately and is starting to be implemented is using forest products and sequestering carbon from forests in things like buildings as a way of mitigating the effects of climate change. And so the Patagonia film, it tells sort of one story. It tells the story of these old growth forests that are being cut down, and sort of we're losing these iconic features of the Pacific Northwest. Connor did a great job of sort of illustrating the history that's happened in New England and the really intensive management that's happened to our forests over millennia. So we're working in a sort of different management regime, a different sort of level of disturbance in these forests already. And so one of the things that foresters are starting to realize is that as long as we keep forests as forests, in the sense of if we actively manage them, if we harvest them and allow them to regenerate, the wood that we're taking out of those forests, as long as we're sequestering them in things like buildings, is just that, it's sequestered, and then the forest can regrow and sequester even more carbon. And so there's these studies that are coming out that are showing that using things like cross-laminated timber and glulam and all these other sort of wood infrastructure in buildings is a great way to sequester carbons, especially in urban environments. And as long as we're allowing those forests to regrow and regenerate after that harvest, then it's sort of a net positive in terms of carbon sequestration. So just curious if there's anything else. I'm sort of rambling on about that, but if you guys want to touch on that sort of element, how we can sort of use use forests as a tool for sequestering more carbon by managing them than if we kind of let them be as they were.
Yeah, I think Aaron, yeah, I appreciate you bringing that up, and I think certainly the way that the film is sort of looking at this very particular, well, a couple of very particular places in the world, and of course we see a lot of sort of differences when we look at sort of a particular local scale in terms of what the history's been and what the biology is and what the geography is of a landscape. And something that for me really stands out is this point it's been made before, but that we have forests here in Connecticut that are relatively uniform age. And so we can't point to lots of examples of old growth in the way that we can point to if we look to various other places around the world, like in British Columbia, for example. We have really this kind of cluster of most of the trees on our landscape being a relatively narrow range of ages. And when thinking about sort of the future and what will kind of help us do the most and do the best in future conditions under climate change, getting more distance between kind of the oldest and the youngest ages of our forest and having more of that diversity on our landscape scale is a good thing, and that involves cutting trees down in some places potentially, or and also sort of looking for places where it makes sense to stop cutting trees down, and kind of making decisions that will help create more of those kind of pockets of diverse types of ages of forests across the landscape. And
I know you do a little bit of that at the game refuge in terms of your I think main focus is, as a game refuge, is creating wildlife habitat, creating quality habitat. And a lot of what you're doing to do that is actually cutting trees, which to many people is counterintuitive. So maybe you can talk a bit about this gets a little bit away from climate change, but sort of the secondary benefit maybe is that we're creating more diverse and heterogeneous forests that are promoting some species that can't survive in just sort of an even aged forest like we have.
Yeah. To kind of go off of what Laura you're saying, I wanted to take a step back, and there's this, we're talking about forests mitigating climate change, and of course, carbon storage was mentioned, and it's a big topic, especially right now in Connecticut, at kind of a policy level for those who are engaged. One thing that's kind of important to remember about New England as a whole is that it's one of the greatest reforestation stories in human history. I mean, we're talking about almost no trees anywhere, and the only ones that were remained were these scraggly little scruff of forest woodlands left. I mean, Connecticut is the least forested New England state. I think 54% of the land is forest, and that doesn't include the urban forest, which is its own, which Matt can attest to. It can be pretty impressive. The only other time in history when we've had such impressive reforestation was after the Black Plague in Europe, and a quarter of the world's population died. So when we think about storing carbon, cutting trees in New England, our forests are extraordinarily resilient, and taking wood and maybe giving it a different life in our home, in our furniture, in our buildings, especially with this new engineered technology that Aaron was talking about, is a tremendous opportunity. And the forest will recover, and it will become more resilient the more we engage with it. Kind of like Laura was saying, if we have a lot of young forest, well, that forest is just getting its start in this new climate that we have, and it may grow differently. And if we have a forest that's all this same age, and we're so worried about preserving it as it is, we may be doing the greatest disservice to our landscape by creating a forest that started growing 100, 150 years. I mean, in 1850, we were just emerging from a little ice age. That's an entirely different climate than we have now, let alone what's going to come in the next 100 years. So I think it's really behooves us to set our forest, like Aaron was saying, at the game refuge up here in Simsbury and Granby, we're really cutting trees only to produce this brushy, young growing forest for wildlife, but it has this tremendous impact on how the forests of the future will grow.
Thank you. Yeah. So I think we've done a good job about sort of talking about forest management and maybe things at the scale of Connecticut or New England. I'm hoping we can bring it back a bit home more. And we've got some specific audience questions that I'm just going to kind of read through, and we'll do our best to answer them together. Let's see where to start. So one is sort of an interesting question, and I think it's important to answer. Someone asked, can you suggest the closest recommended forest for visitors to walk through? And I think that's sort of a disconnect between the way that we as sort of foresters think of forests and the general public think of forests. Really, any patch of trees can be considered a forest. When we're talking about forests here, it doesn't have to be 1,000 acres of contiguous forest. The Land Trust's 20 acres down on Davenport Ridge Road, that's a forest. So anything we're talking about here can really be applied to the suburban landscape in New Canaan and to a much more rural landscape in other places in Connecticut. So just wanted to kind of to clear that up.
If I may,
Yeah.
Aaron, I think one of the most important things for me as an urban forester is getting people to make the connection between their backyard and the urban forest. The tree in front of their house is part of the collective urban forest. It doesn't need to be something that's out there. You can certainly go and experience those spaces. But right in New Haven, East Rock is a fantastic forest to walk through. It's an urban park. There's the Land Trust, the New Haven Land Trust manages a nature preserve, Quinnipiac Meadows, which is one of my absolute favorite places in New Haven. You can walk down and be near the marshes right along the Mill River and literally not even know, Quinnipiac River, and literally not even know that you're in a city. I mean, it's incredible. And so it depends what you're looking for. But I think getting people to understand that they are not separate from forests. Forests don't need to be out there. They can be here. It is really important. And if you walk to work, you may walk through a forest every day. So kind of reframing, I think, is important. But those are two recommendations for me right in New Haven if you want to experience more of an urban forest. They're both really wonderful spaces.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's important to think of, I mean, if you look at Google Images, if you take a look at New Haven, I believe it's one of like the most forested cities in the US. And even though it's dense housing and everything's kind of on top of each other, if you look at it above, there's trees there, and that's a forest. There's animals living in those trees, and Matt, you can probably talk about this more than I, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you've ever stood at the top of East Rock, you know exactly what we're talking about, or at the top of Sleeping Giant. You see parts of the buildings of New Haven, but it's not this whole swath of deforested area. So it's really this kind of continuum, I would say.
Perfect. So one of the other questions we have is sort of about this thinking of tree replacement as climate is changing. And so I want to start with one of the first questions is, where is it? What changes in the climate do you anticipate? I think most of the climate studies for our region, sort of the southern New England region, forecast warmer temperatures, increased and more severe precipitation events, and I think also more severe sort of storm, tornado slash microburst slash hurricane events. So when we're talking about changing climates, that's sort of what I think we're thinking of. And then so some of the other questions sort of with that in the back of the mind is what species might we be thinking of if we need to take down a tree because it's at risk of falling on our house, or if a tree is just old and naturally needs to come down, what are some things we can replace it with? And I'm going to go back one step. One person asked about the ash trees. We do have this invasive pest called the emerald ash borer. That's probably what your arborist was referring to in the question you asked. That's going to pretty much decimate all the ash trees. So maybe let's use that as an example. Somebody's got a beautiful big ash tree in their front yard. Unfortunately, this invasive pest is going to take care of that pretty quickly. What can people at home start to think about in terms of what they're planting? And maybe we can start to give Matt too much mic time, but Matt does a lot of work with sort of urban tree planting. So I think he'll have some great insight on this.
Yeah, so there's a few different strategies. Some of the more recent thinking that I've read and encountered is actually you can keep similar species, but look for more specifically adapted members of that species. So ash is not a good example for that specific scenario. But let's say that we find that some of our maples are not surviving as long, or they're tending to get more disease, or they're declining earlier than we would expect them to as climate continues to change. Well, one of the things that we do at URI is we work with growers from around the country, and typically we try and mix the growers that we work with. We order some of our trees from northern growers. So up near Buffalo, we've ordered from growers in Canada, and also southern growers. And so the next time we order a shipment of maples, we may try and focus that shipment at some of our southern nurseries, just because those trees have grown up in a slightly warmer climate, something that we may expect our climate might start to mimic over the next 50 to 100 years. So that's keeping within the species. Another thing we can do is introduce species that are native to, let's say, the eastern United States, but further south than we are. One of the examples that we're trying now at URI is Yellowwood. Yellowwood traditionally has been native to the southeastern United States up into the Carolinas and maybe a bit further north than that, but we've been planting it with good success here in New Haven. So starting to think about some of the plants where we may be relatively close to the northern end of their range of, trying to work some of those in, seeing how they perform. But it's important to understand that you know, urban forestry, it's educated guessing to some degree, right? It's experimental and it's iterative. And we have, I think, a bit more flexibility in that regard than, say, maybe more traditional forest management, because we can't rely on natural reseeding of trees that are there, right? So we almost have a blank slate. It allows us to test some new options. And I know there's a lot of controversy, obviously, about non-native trees, but that, of course, is an option as well. It's a risk always. That's how we ended up with Norway maples, right? Which are a pretty significant issue now in urban areas and in surrounding forested areas. I think something like 15% of the tree canopy of New Haven is still Norway maples, even though we haven't planted any in the last 10 plus years. But there is opportunity. There are some trees that just don't grow in the eastern United States or in the continental United States that are well adapted to urban conditions, and it's something worth exploring too. I would say the first two options, though, are probably the first steps, exploring both more resilient individuals within a species and also exploring more southern but native to the United States species, and beginning to expand those ranges.
Connor or Laura, do you want to build on that at all, or Matt was pretty thick?
I would say if you're not restrained to a small yard tree, like an oak or a hickory, they have withstood a lot of climatic changes across New England. And if you're a bird watching fanatic, plant a white oak. For those of you who are familiar with Doug Ptolemy, he's an entomologist who studies insects and birds and their relationship through trees, and he's identified more species of caterpillar on white oak trees than any other tree species in the native to the Northeast. I think something like 583 different species of caterpillar, and that's just caterpillar. That's not all the other insects. Sugar maples only have 290 caterpillars, almost only half. So if you want a resilient tree that's also great for wildlife, the whole point with the caterpillars is because birds eat caterpillars, and a Carolina tree will eat 9,000 caterpillars in one breeding season. So you want birds and you want resilience, I go with white oak.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. And I will not really to add a whole lot new, but just to point out, Connecticut is sort of due to our location in sort of southern New England. We're actually potentially a little bit better positioned than some of the more northern New England states in terms of having these species on our landscapes already that have been a part of our forests for thousands of years, like our oaks, like our hickories, that from the science it looks like are in a position to perhaps continue to do fairly well here in the foreseeable future with climate change. So particularly in sort of more southern Connecticut, certainly in New Canaan, that's very much the case. We're sort of right on the border where there are a lot of species that grow here in Connecticut that if you were, up in Massachusetts or up into southern Vermont or New Hampshire, you might think about actually looking to Connecticut's forests and sort of pulling some of the species that are more common here and sending them north. But
Great, thank you guys. One more audience question here. So what is the health of forests in New Canaan? And when I read the rest of this question, you guys will be able to chime in. I know you're not super familiar with our forests, but I see a lot of fallen dead trees and invasive species. Is that an indication of poor health? So just sort of as background from the person on the panel that does work in New Canaan, I think there's sort of different ways you can quantify forest health. It's important to remember that New Canaan's forests are fairly fragmented. We live in a very suburban area, and so they are more susceptible to things like invasive species just because there's more edge around each of our properties. I had the good fortune of visiting Connor at his 4,400 acre game refuge earlier last year, and we were marveling. He has something like 10 times the acreage, but only 3 times the perimeter, and so that's just that much more perimeter for people who have planted things that are invasive to get into our properties, or for things like that to happen. So the suburban environment in which we work tends to lead to some more forest issues than you might see in more intact forests and more rural parts of the state or New England. In terms of fallen dead trees, that's not necessarily a sign of poor forest health. Unfortunately, a lot of the trees that we're seeing dying around New Canaan, I'm sure in the lands that you work and manage and play on, for our panelists, the vast majority of what we see falling are those ash trees that we mentioned before. And it's not necessarily a sign of poor overall forest health. It's a sign that this species is declining, and unfortunately is probably going to be lost and see a similar fate to things like the chestnut. But so the important thing is also to look at sort of what's coming up under those trees. And I think this is something that homeowners can apply to their properties. So if you do have that ash tree that fell, and maybe it's not in the middle of your yard, but it's kind of in the back in your woodlands, maybe that extra acre that you've got back in your 2-acre zone. If that ash tree falls, what's coming up underneath it? And if it is things like invasive species, that's an opportunity for you to take an active approach, maybe manage some of those invasive species and promote sort of a more, I guess you'd call it, natural forest succession, seeing if there are things that have seeded in that just are getting outcompeted by the invasive species. So try to find that little oak seedling and see if you can't build a little cage around it and protect it from our very, very hungry deer. See if you can't give it a little bit of light from our very, very aggressive burning bush. So yeah, that's just another way that folks can maybe manage what we think of it as forest. You probably think of it as just like the trees behind your house. That's all forest. So and anything else that we can kind of build off with that from our panelists.
I would just say two things. We talked about, I was asked about what can we do as trees are dying. Planting new trees is great. Protecting what we have is better, right? It's going to take a large tree, something like Connor's white oak. A mature white oak is going to provide exponentially more benefit than a white oak that I plant tomorrow. And it's going to take that white oak that I plant tomorrow, if it survives, 40 to 50 to 60 years to begin to provide benefits on the same magnitude. So protecting what we have is massively important. And I would say that, again, just echoing what Aaron said, dead trees aren't necessarily an indicator of poor forest health. Disturbance, tree death, cycling is a natural part of forest dynamics. But if you begin to look closer and it died because of an invasive species, or you see invasive species present in that forest, then that is cause for concern. And if we can catch those, some of those plants early, then it can have huge impact. Saving one mature tree from, let's say, bittersweet or porcelain vine is so impactful. So I think, there's a lot of really, really good questions in the chat about what can you do as a homeowner. I would say you really are eyes and ears and managers on the ground. Think of each of yourselves as a mini forest manager, right? We can't be everywhere and see everything. So if you report things that you're seeing, if you, maybe next time you go on a hike and you see a vine that's strangling a tree, maybe bring a pair of hand pruners with you and clip it off. Your friends or family might think you're a little insane, but my friends and family thought that about me for a long time. So I'd say, just thinking of yourself as both a frontline kind of mini manager of these forests, but then also as an advocate too, speaking up on behalf and letting the experts in your community know about these things so then they can begin to act on a larger scale.
I actually wanted to throw this question to you, Laura. For those of you who don't know, Laura is also a botanist, so I've benefited from her expertise up here at the Game Refuge. But Laura, could you just say a few words about like how forest health can be interpreted through like rare species or species diversity and stuff that you've seen in your work?
Yeah, sure. We've been really focused on trees today. And trees are one incredible class category of trees. There was actually, there's a question in the movie and I saw a question in the chat also from somebody who said, so what is a tree actually? Which is honestly a great question. And there's a reason why all those scientists laughed when they were asked in the movie. But I love trees of all sizes, plants of all sizes. And the sort of total diversity of plant species that we have here in Connecticut is really concentrated actually not in trees, in all the plants that aren't trees, that are smaller than trees, growing down underneath the trees. So when I go into a forest and I'm looking at around a forest, your woods, in your backyard, when I'm driving down the side of a highway, I'm also looking at what's growing. That's not a tree, that's not a woody plant. And sort of the richness of that, which in terms of the number of species that I see and what kinds of species, there are a huge range of different kinds of habitats that we have here in Connecticut based on things like the underlying geology and where you're positioned. Are you up in sort of in the hills? Are you down in a valley? Are you along a trap rock ridge like I am? I'm in Connecticut. Obviously, I'm in New Haven right now, which is along a trap rock ridge. All these different factors lead to these really amazing sort of small pocket sites that have different collections of really interesting, wonderful understory plants, smaller plants. And so there's a lot of value, I think, in if you're interested, getting to know those plants as well in your backyard when you go out looking at the trees, but also looking at what's growing underneath the trees as well. So yeah, that's a sort of, it just opens up a huge can of worms. You know,
Yeah.
you could look at anything on that. Yeah.
Perfect. Well, unfortunately, we're already over time. We said we were going to go to 8:30, but I think that's a really good place to wrap up. I'd like to kind of go back to what Matt said about sort of everybody's property that they're managing. You're your own little forest manager there, and one of the big initiatives for the Land Trust is to get people to think about their properties the same way that we think about ours. So we're managing our properties for values like habitat and trying to sequester carbon and water filtration. Think about how you can manage your properties in that way. And then also just building this connection between people and forest. I just wrote down a quote from the film, and it said, one of the scientists said, you can start caring about the forest, or you start caring about a forest because you know it, and it's part of who you are. And so I think that's a really important maybe message to end on, and also just a theme, especially in the world that we're living in now. We've seen so many people sort of migrating back into nature and getting out and going hiking and going for walks. Take some time to just sit in the woods and observe and connect with wherever it is that you go for a walk, or whatever patch of woods or forest it is that you recreate in, because you can start to learn a lot and you can start to feel like it's really yours. So with that, I do want to thank everybody. I know we didn't get to all the questions and answers. I'm happy to stay on and sort of answer those in writing. If folks didn't get theirs answered, they can stay on and see if my message pops up. But I do want to give the panelists just any last opportunity to say anything that we might have missed that they think is important, and then we'll wrap it up.
I would love to just say one other thing that popped into my brain that seemed relevant that we didn't get to, which was in this conversation about, you know, what can you do, and you know, how do we protect forests, and how do we think about how do we sequester the most carbon, and of course, you know, the carbon that we're sequestering in forests is really important. But it's also important to stop emitting so much carbon. We really cannot catch up if we're still sort of continuing to emit at the same levels. But I just wanted to sort of point out that here in the Northeast, at the moment, the leading loss of forest land that we have throughout the New England region is due to development. So it's not due to sort of forest operations, logging and cutting down trees, but the sort of net loss of forest that we have at the regional scale is because of, you know, we want to build new things, stores, houses, etc. So I think we can sort of think about shifting our framework a little bit on that topic. I think that's a kind of a powerful point. But yeah, get to know your backyard, get to know your woods.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah,
I mean, that's a great pitch for why the Land Trust is so important, and trying to sort of conserve land, and why the work that we all do in terms of managing land and conserving land and figuring out what to do with it once it's been conserved is so important. Connor, sounded like you were going to say something.
Yeah, I really wanted to. You guys both teed me up pretty well. You mentioned the Suzanne Simard quote at the end when she said that, you know, really you get to know your forest and you can love it more. What she says right before that is educate yourself and become aware. And I think that, you know, what Laura's just saying is that there's a lot of vitriol between conservationists and land managers, especially people who do any timber operating. And it's really important to remember, just like Laura said, you know, cutting trees isn't the loss of the forest. It's the changing of the forest. It becomes a new forest for what grows back. The end of a forest is development. And so, you know, I think it's what Aaron is saying. Like, I would encourage people to go to people like Aaron, that, you know, that lead their land trusts and do more than just learn your forest. Educate yourself on what is happening. Like, coming to these seminars is really good. I mean, I learn a lot from, you know, my colleagues. But yeah, become educated. Be more than just present in the forest. Know what is going to happen to that forest and how that forest got there, and what your visiting that forest might mean for it. It's, you know, things are complex, and simplifying it is always somewhat dangerous.
Yeah, I'll just add very quickly. I think these sorts of big scale issues can feel so paralyzing, but understand that every tree that's protected, every tree that's planted, every property that's conserved or that's sustainably managed all matters, right? If you're walking on a street in New Haven, you may see individual trees, and you go stand on the top of East Rock and you see the forest as a whole, right? Each of those trees is part of that. So I would say just, we wouldn't exist and we wouldn't be able to do the work that we do without the passion and support and person power and advocacy of the citizens of New Haven. So see if your town has any sort of nonprofit, land trust, anyone that's actively engaged in this sort of tree preservation, management, conservation work. And if there isn't, see what you can do, what steps can be taken to start something like that. It doesn't have to start big. And I encourage you to check out websites of established organizations as inspiration for that. I put our website in the chat. I encourage you all to check it out. Some of the programs that we do, ways to get involved with us. And if you don't specifically feel like getting your hands dirty and maybe planting a tree or sustainably managing a forest, there are people who can. And so also supporting the experts in your community is a great way to do that as well. So just thank you all for being here and engaging in this conversation. I think that's a wonderful kind of launch point to the rest of this, right?
Yeah, and it's also a great reminder for me to thank the partners that were involved in putting this program on, including Planet New Canaan, the Conservation Commission, and of course the New Canaan Library. So again, thank you all for attending. Thank you so much to our panelists. This has been wonderful. I think we'll have to do it again because it seemed like we could have kept talking for hours. But thank you all. I appreciate it so much. And we'll be following this up with an email with a bit more information about some of the things we talked about. So again, I'll stay on and answer questions if folks want through the chat or the Q&A feature. But have a great night and thank you for joining us.